Hi everyone, this is Tech in EdTech. In this podcast, we discuss technology that powers education and improves learning for all. Welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Ritesh Chopra, and a guest for today's podcast is Ashwath Bharath, Senior Director, Movement Building at Teach for India. Ashwath, thanks for joining me today, and welcome to today's show.
Thank you, Ritesh. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, I think it's going to be equally mesmerizing for us as well to hear your thoughts and see how do we help your movement. And I think it's a very social movement that you have. And I really
Yeah.
look forward for this enriching conversation, Ashwath, with you.
All right.
And I think before we begin a deep dive into the topic, Ashwath, today I think I'd like to understand a bit of your background and how you got into the role with Teach for India. What's been your journey
Yeah.
so far into this role? If you could give me a little bit of background on that, that would
Yeah,
be
certainly. Yeah. So I was born and raised in Hyderabad. I would say in many ways it's a normal childhood. Had a lot of curiosity, loved playing a lot of sports, math, physics, especially astronomy. Um, I think my interest towards life sciences got me to do biotech in my undergraduation. So I did a BTech in biotech in Hyderabad. But through that and post that, I did my master's by research in bioinformatics at IIIT Hyderabad again. I think somehow through that journey in college, there was this interest that was developing towards politics, public administration, just society at large, and if things can be better, if we can make better decisions as a collective. So that really got me to want to actually explore this space. So post my masters, I actually volunteered in an NGO called as Sodios, which is based out of the Vellore district in Tamil Nadu. So I had the opportunity there to work for close to 8 months with first generation school goers, not even learners from tribal backgrounds, in surrounding villages from there. I think that experience kind of gave me a very different perspective to otherwise what's the perspective I have of society, even if it's coming through mainstream media, news. It's largely, probably opinions of what the government is thinking or private sector is thinking. But I think what's happening in the social space was something, unless you experience it directly, you really don't kind of bring in those worldviews. And so subsequently, the Teach for India fellowship seemed very, attractive because one is there were these long conversations I used to have in college with friends on what is the purpose of education, how should we be learning, like what is it we are getting from these degrees. And so it seemed like almost like an opportunity to challenge some of those conventions and really work towards what could be possible alternatives or be at least in the pursuit of that. So the 2 years fellowship gave me an opportunity to teach 120 students math in Pune. So that's when I moved to Pune, and subsequently I was there for 8 years. I think the fellowship was a very enriching experience for me. Like as much as the students learned, I feel even I've also learned and developed through that. But it basically instilled this belief that you know if the right conditions or the right environment is created, children from any background could even surpass your expectations. So, how do you really have that champion for a child? How do you really create that ecosystem? I think that kind of became something which I wanted to, explore more. It seemed like a complex social challenge, and in many ways, started seeing how it also affects, society at large. So, I stayed back and Teach for India. I worked with the government relations team, had the opportunity to work with some local, state level, and even central level projects. But I think eventually working with the government also sometimes brings in that a little bit of impatience. So there was this itch towards technology. After my biotech, I did bioinformatics in masters. Even during the 2 years of my fellowship back in 2012, 2013 itself, each of my students had these tablets and they were learning math from Khan Academy through an offline Raspberry Pi server. And so I decided that I'll work with Teach for India's online EdTech platform, which is developed exclusively for educators in India. And so I've been working with that. And today, along with that, recently moved into this role called the Senior Director for Movement Building at Teach for India, where we basically look at a lot of our external and scale work. So work with government, our edtech platform, work in rural India, our alumni who've done the fellowship, much like me, we have a network of around 4,500 plus of them. So that's where I am today, and based out of Bangalore now for the last 3 years.
Thank you so much for that, for those insights, Ashwath. Very varied and very illustrative journey from astronomy to pretty much doing, I would say, bioengineering, biotechnology to where you are today in education and
Yeah,
empowering India with education. Very illustrative, very impressive. Thanks for that. And while you touched upon technology towards your answer and your introduction and your role as well, I think I
yeah,
want to touch upon and understand. I think because you touch upon India at large, right? India
yeah,
working with different government initiatives. I think it be pertinent to ask you about how do you see, where does in respect to your role, how do you see technology playing and making a society more equitable, accessible, and
yeah,
easy with respect to education?
yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. On a broader sense, right, to that question, actually, definitely there's the access to information and content, right? Like that's one big disruptor that technology has brought in over the last couple of decades. I think the other example that comes to my mind is in just what we call as inclusivity, like technology actually enabling people with different abilities. And then within the scope of EdTech itself, there are so many pieces, right? There's remote and personalized access, there's learning and feedback loops, there's opportunity to connect and collaborate. And now with AI really kind of finding its feet, I think the idea of instant multilingual content being available, I think there's a big role there in, through these aspects that I see technology kind of really moving us towards a more equitable society. um, I think the best kind of analogy that comes to my mind is that given India's demographics today and where it's kind of moving in the next decade or two, if we really have to accommodate all children right from primary school to higher education, we should be building brick and mortar institutions like at least 20 schools every 7 to 10 days, and at least and 4 to 5 colleges every 7 to 10 days to really be able to absorb the capacity of the growing population and the next generation that's coming. So I don't think so that's possible. And definitely, again, technology is going to be the a huge platform in itself. I think few years from now, like how we talk about number of children in government school, number of children in private school, I think there will be a new bucket, which is number of children who are learning online or blended, and not necessarily part of traditional school system. So that's how I kind of see it as play out. Yeah, on a very broader sense.
Great. No, absolutely. I kind of echo those thoughts because as technology, it's a physically it's difficult to have the best teacher available everywhere, even in the remote areas.
Yeah,
But if you have the best of technology and the best of education, digitally you can give them all equal education, and that digital quality as an education can be shared across everyone, no matter where you're sitting in a remote area or you're sitting in an urban city. They all can consume the same quality digital education.
yeah,
So absolutely, and I think you we're seeing a lot of innovations around AI impacting and ensuring that they're creating new avenues for education. And how do we improve education and improve the accessibility? So I think those will certainly be new trends that we're seeing
yeah,
in what we are working as well. But
yeah,
talking about that, Ashwath, what are I'll be interested to knowing what are different type of learning modalities are
yeah,
being used by your team today, and
yeah,
what are your thoughts on how do we kind of increase the engagement around accessibility of education?
yeah. Yeah, I think this kind of plays out in two levels, right? Like, what are learning modalities based on one's own understanding of what's an excellent education or purpose of education? And the second is in the context of tech, the conversation we are having. I think education sector was this one sector with, in my observation, which really kind of didn't change with changing times. You see entertainment really, adopting tech. You see medical sector adopting tech, and so many others as well. Healthcare, sorry. But with education, I think COVID and the pandemic and schools actually shutting down kind of was like a forced blessing, for the sector to really think about what was the purpose of education, and whether the traditional form of schooling, learning, does it have any relevance, or are there alternate ways to actually meet those objectives? So I think very similarly for us as well in COVID, we had to really adapt there. And so we kind of raised funds to deploy tablets to our students, provide data, and really slowly start moving into kind of a blended way of not just training our fellows who work as full-time educators, but them also delivering that content to students. And I think over the last 2 3 years, there's been back and forth because schools reopen and then it closes. So we kind of still have been kind of having that dance of online and offline in-person learning. I think to the first point which I had made, when we are thinking about it largely in an in-person space or an online space, when I'm talking about learning modality, or when I'm thinking about it generally, we base it on three principles. Like one is, how do you create safe spaces for students? Like classrooms shouldn't be the space of fear. There needs to be a space where students feel comfortable. There's also joy that's present. How do we look at the second principle is, how do we look at students as partners in learning, right? Like how do we move from the traditional power structures of what a teacher holds, a student holds, and really look at students being partners. And I've actually seen that when students are partners, the idea of personalized learning or customized learning really kind of unlocks in a new level. And the third is kind of all of this being in service to, can we foster the or unlock student voice, agency, their own leadership as well. So, but with respect to technology, particularly the way kind of I'm seeing what's happening today across, few hundred classrooms that we are working in, is that one is we are continuing to use tablets to increase the instructional time, because again, most schools that we work with, especially the government schools, have just 4 hours of instructional time. The school might be open for 5 hours, which is 4 hours, which is actually a very limited time, knowing what the learning gaps are. So our teachers, our fellows do kind of use tablets to continue the instructional time beyond the school hours physically. But again, within the classroom, it's the entire range. We see our fellows using technology right from a simple projector to actually building projects from kits as well. I think to your second part of question, in terms of what do we really need, right? I think we need to have more open source resources for sure, but we also need to move towards more than just content, right? I think the learning experience has to be contextualized. So it's not just about translating a content or contextualizing just content, which is what today edtech systems are competing with traditional form of schools. But it needs to move beyond that, right? And everything else which comes then under broadened data access and reducing the digital divide. I think these are few things. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Ashwath. I think this is, you kind of pressed the right buttons, and you kind of mentioned a lot of points in your answer there. I think I kind of agree that technology we should use more like an enabler. Otherwise, we're seeing a lot of trends about edtech these days, but I think there is more of tech and less of education. I think you talked about learning efficiency, creating learning experiences which should be more impactful to students. I think I kind of
Yeah.
agree that technology should be taken more like an enabler, than
Yeah.
than seeing technology as everything. And I think you also talked about, very interestingly, I was having a conversation, Ashwath, with someone, and we talked about, will technology go a lot of other industries route, right? Like you talked about other industries like healthcare, say
Yeah.
for example music as well, right?
Yeah.
With the help of music, I think it has made everything so cheap, right?
Yeah.
Everything is available online. People can download anything rather than buying those floppy disk or CDs.
Yeah.
Okay, so it has made everything so accessible. So can education do that with the help of technology? I think that was an interesting conversation. We kind of touched on that chord as well in your answer.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely, very insightful on that. I think the other thing is, what I'm trying to understand from you is, Ashwath, where you are. Do you see especially the audience that you cater, right? The underprivileged, the rural audience of India. Do you see they being greater acceptance on technology there, right? How do
Yeah.
you see there about they accepting technology?
Yeah.
Because we see a lot of that resistance from largely teachers, right, accepting the technology. But
Yeah.
what is your kind of view on that? That will be helpful to kind of
Yeah.
for the audience here.
Yeah. I mean, I shared a similar perspective, to be honest. If you would have asked me pre-pandemic, Ritesh, I would have said that there is this. Um, there are two things which I at least sense when I talk to teachers. One is the thing that I need to learn something new. What's wrong with what I'm currently doing? Why is that not enough? And the second is this something that I'm going to learn something new. Is this actually going to start replacing me, or is it going to disrupt what I know about my job or everything familiar, right? So that was a sentiment I've sensed it. And I think post pandemic it kind of the card was forced upon, where clearly it became that teachers who don't adapt to technology will be replaced by those who do, right?
Yeah, it's
So
like a blessing in disguise, right?
yeah,
The
yeah,
pandemic.
yeah.
Mm.
So in that sense, it definitely is, right? So, but the way I look at it right today, I don't know if I have a definite answer. I feel the bottom line is that it is still people dependent. But I know this is also going to change and change really fast, and probably we can talk about it on where things are going in the coming years. But when I say it's people dependent, it's either dependent on the learner. So what's one's own motivation, ambition, abilities, and you see that's the struggle with a lot of MOOCs, right? And on the other side, even if
Mm.
you see it's more on the educator, then it's actually what is the educator's ability to experiment, to continue to learn. I think the things which I was mentioning earlier, and more importantly, do they use tech as a tool to learn themselves, right? But at least my observation is that even though this has not been the case with learners and educators, where they've not, it is still people dependent. I think from the tech side, we've gone through great lens of engineering. Let it be to customize, to gamify, to track, to give real time feedback, to differentiate, right? So I definitely think that it is still people dependent. So you're right when you say that there are people who still kind of resist how it kind of enables. But on the other hand, I think now kind of it's a forced adaptation where this kind of is the way future is going. But there's also probably a third kind who are just skeptics, right, of overall what's the impact about this. And I think this was something which you had spoken about earlier. And personally, for me also, I keep going back and forth. I feel this is one of those buckets which is the biggest thing which is questionable, because at one level, most of the edtech products, including us, we operate at the level of tech metrics. So number of new users, returning users, session time, bounce rate, looking at these kind of metrics. But that does not, and there's a lot of data analysis also to it, right? So how much content has been consumed, number of hours of videos that's been seen and things. But we still need to close that gap of what is all of this adding to with the end users. I think there are ways now, but it's still something as a sector I feel we need to solve for. I think the second is what I was mentioning is in terms of currently, if you see, a lot of edtech is delivering content, right? And of course, in much more engaging and creative ways. But we are still thinking about education in the sense of traditional subjects of delivering math concepts or science or history. But if you look at what's come out in the national education policy, the national curriculum framework that's released a few weeks earlier this year, is actually kind of really moving away from that traditional sense of education itself. So I do feel that tech needs to evolve to really move from just access and exposure to information, to building interpersonal skills, bringing in values based education, fostering that idea of student voice and agency. And this is where I feel I'm very hopeful with AI really bridging that gap, like being able to really walk that additional mile of where a content ends to where a learner learns and really applies it. So yeah, that's my overall take on that.
Great, thanks, Ashwath. I think you already spilled the beans of your wisdom around what you see
Yeah.
coming up in the future, right, for your area. So I think that's great. And
Yeah.
I think we talked about resistance. We talked about teachers, right? The
Yeah.
pertinent question that I may have, and I often ask, and kind of when I in my discussion with people, is about How do you think talented people, right, kind of embracing teaching as a profession, okay,
Yeah,
more like a passion, because it's more like a social responsibility,
yeah,
especially for a country like us. We're still developing a lot of road to cover for us. Because taking and helping people take that as a passion to improve overall student learning and outcomes. So,
yeah,
what are your thoughts around that? Ashwin?
yeah. No, I mean, this question is quite personal, right? This is something we've spent the last decade or 13 years around. I honestly find ourselves to be in an chicken and egg situation because just think about this, right? Like, at least me growing up in the traditional classroom systems in 90s, and assuming it's the same for you as well, like pretty much our experience of education has not been really path breaking, right? It is time filled between lunch break and different intervals, or playing with and meeting friends before or after school. And it's just something that you had to do and you just did. And maybe there might be these few aha moments, but largely it's not been something which is inspiring, really tapping into one's expression and letting one shine, right? On the other hand, you're actually put through standardized tests, and probably at times, majority of the students don't feel as successful as a result of that, right? So, and you see the person standing in front of you actually responsible for this experience, so that profession on its own is not inspiring anymore. It's You really don't experience the potential and the power of what a great classroom can be, and so that's not a space where you want to associate your future with. I mean, that's I feel like that's one side of the problem. But having said that, what I've seen, at least with our work over the last 13 years across 8 cities impacting thousands of children, is that in many ways I've realized that our society and our nation is actually built in our classroom, right? Like, depending on what kind of a space the classroom is, who is included, who is not, who is standing in front of the children as role models, and so on. And I really feel that today there's a lot of purpose of education towards employment, right? So unless the conversation of education moves towards classrooms and schools being centers of not just economic progress but social progress as well, I think the real weight of the profession of teaching, making teaching aspirational, doesn't really come in. But again, on the other side, to your point, like, how do you go beyond its social responsibility? I think that's where kind of we need to let market forces really play in. Today, your entry and retention barriers are completely off, right? Like, it's very hard to become a teacher in a government school, but once you do, uh, you will most probably going to retire as a teacher no matter how effective you are. So these have to flip, right? So it should be easier for anybody to really experiment with the profession, and as they continue to do well and as they continue to find their feet in it, they continue to stay in the profession, right? And honestly, even in my own experience of teaching, what I've realized is the more you teach, the truth is that you also learn as much, right? So one of the things which we are trying to do in Teach for India is really saying, how can we really bring the brightest and most compassionate citizens to be those role models in the classroom to actually teach and foster that learning space, right? So that's one at one level. I think the other level, just building off it, is that just saying that, um, I think we also need to see what's the power of being part of a profession like being a teacher, right? What is the network you're kind of being access to? Is your career just stagnating? Once you're a teacher, are you just a teacher? Do you kind of get like higher degrees or move to higher grades of teaching? But is that it, or is there other ways an educator profile can be looked at? I think these are two things which I would definitely leave it to market forces. And the reason why I'm saying is there's a lot more you can elaborate on it, on really what happens in the affordable private space and how much teachers are paid from few hundred to couple thousand rupees, and really what it means to allow market forces to play there. But I think in the end, my last appeal is that there's also a lot of beauty just being with children. It's really energizing. It keeps one at the edge of their seat. And the beauty is really that every day is a new day, because you see that children don't have a lot of fixed baggage that they carry. Even if it is, it's kind of open to exploring something. And in many ways, they end up teaching you some of the most important life lessons in the most simple of ways. So I would say these three things. Yeah.
Oh, great, thanks for those insights, Ashwath. Very helpful. And I think rightly so, because if we can inspire today's generation, because see, these are the generation today is digital natives, and how we are seeing uh, today's generation is required to embrace that digital and kind of pass on that, and ensuring that if today's generation can become good teachers, they can actually instill and ensure that using digital technology, that's what they do, can actually add a lot of value to the overall education. So absolutely, I think kind of aligned to what you said. And how do you see all this play around getting into, say, when you talked about the new standards in India, uh, about education standards at large, right? How do you
Yeah,
see they come along and improving the overall standards, working
yeah,
on government, working on building
yeah,
standardizing education and making it more affordable and effective for the entire community at large? What are your thoughts around that?
yeah. I think I would start off with first holding a certain paradox, because usually wherever technology is entered any kind of market or sector, it has kind of pushed for a certain level of standardization, almost like disruptive silver bullet of sorts. And also, that's also what, say, in many ways, is the conversation of technology in education and the idea of standardizing education. But the paradox or the other side to that is education finally is effective if it is learner specific, right? So those are the two things which we need to keep in mind. But I think in terms of how do I see it happening, to be honest, I actually see everything is happening right now. But what I see happening in the coming few years, it's going to be done really, really well. So let it be in terms of accessibility, access of a technology or learning, let it be affordability, let it be the idea of collaboration, personalization, right? Co-tutoring with AI. I think what I see play out is that the learning. You and I probably know it, and in many ways, our work demands it, that learning is beyond your formal systems and the period you spent in school, right? That you need to constantly be learning and adapting in that sense. So I think the idea of getting feedback, getting asking anyone, anytime, anything, I think all of that is already happening now, and it's just going to happen exponentially better. And I also see this in terms of the domains as well, right? So let it be introduction of coding, robotics, AI into the curriculum at younger ages. I think the idea of kind of preparing the coming generations towards that idea of learning, that idea of working, and that idea of how society is really going to convene is already starting to play in. I think the other thing which I would also obviously, which you're already seeing and more of it will happen, is just that online learning platforms will be offering that content, the courses, the learning experiences at a fraction of the cost. And the bridge between online and offline learning, like whatever the gap could be, I think with AI coming in, that gap will also soon be bridged, is my bet. So I think that's how I see uh, you know, education standards kind of shaping at large. It's just more of what we are doing, but done really well.
Great. No, absolutely. I think this has been great to hear your thoughts around that, Ashwath. And I think kind of to kind of wrap up the conversation, like to seek some of your advice, some of your words of wisdom. uh, then for companies like global EdTech players or
Yeah,
global EdTech providers, to kind of how do you see companies who are going global, or someone like us who are helping EdTech companies globally?
yeah,
What is it? What is it that you think would be some of your advice to kind of help us create more affordable, impactful education beyond the curriculum, as you rightly mentioned? I think that's an important aspect. It's not
yeah,
about the books or the curriculum. I think more about taking care of the underprivileged communities, right? Because I think
yeah,
those are those where there is no money gets kind of affected because of change in technology, right?
yeah,
So, because education is a very noble area, right? Kind of gives,
yeah,
personally to me, a lot of satisfaction being a part of education.
yeah.
So, I think what will be your advice for someone like global edtech company to serve the community at large, including and bring in the underprivileged community as well under fold when they look at creating new learning experiences there?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. The irony is that these are the children who actually, for them, tech could be like this game changer, because otherwise, the gaps that are filled from home environment, social network access, and all of that is not something which is there. To your question, to be honest, I'm thinking about it in three levels, right? Like, what can, say, individual entities or players think about? What can we do as an edtech collective, and also largely as education as a sector? And so some of these might be interesting ideas, some you might already be familiar with. But I think one good place to start off is to see if we can have at least 25% of our platform features or content just part of open source or free to access for anybody. I think the second one that comes to my mind again at an individual is how fast can we move into multilingual and, even if possible, multicultural content and engagement. Right. I think the third one, especially for it to be a holistic education, learning is just not about cognitive aspects like, consuming content or understanding even application of a content, but also there is a social aspect to learning, in my opinion. And there's this practice that needs to strengthen through regular feedback, reflection. So it's not just about content coverage and syllabus completion, but to actually expand that definition. I think specifically, to what you'd asked as well, one of the things I was thinking about is that we really need to start opening up to the counterparts, in different sectors. So if I'm doing something with edtech on teacher education, like I need to be more proximate with edtech players in teacher education or otherwise in the private sector and the government sector, and vice versa with the government entities and private sectors, like whichever level you're playing at with respect to your edtech implementation or solution or offering. Like, let's try to seek not just other players in the same sector, but across sectors as well. I think having those spaces and those conversations and that exposure might just open up new possibilities. Um, yeah. The one last point, I think, to be honest, at an individual level here, is also a little bit being responsible about product usage when it comes to gamification and usage time. Because, like, on one hand, yes, edtech is completely through products, so product usage time really matters to us, and the way we kind of close the loops, give those instant gratification, gamify things. Is the idea is to make it engaging, sometimes with the best intention for learners to stay longer, to learn better. But there's a price to be paid in terms of what else can somebody be doing at that time, and how else can they be learning. I know it's a little counter, but I think it's important for us to just hold that perspective at different times. As a collective, to be honest, I think I would like for us as a collective to really look at it in phases, right? So can we say the first phase is actually to replace every admin, every paperwork that happens across the education system, government, private, higher education, anywhere, to be replaced by tech, so that tech is just normalized, right? And then as we move towards that, then actually bringing tech into classrooms and schools to really look at it from a perspective of building exposure and skills. And that's when I think, the adoption towards teachers really looking at it almost like a co-tutor that's helping them with personalized learning, giving real-time feedback, being able to pace it on the learner. I think those are things we can really explore as a collective. And the last point, right, at a sector level, uh, I think we need to keep being in the pursuit of expanding what the purpose of education is, because I really think the future of edtech will evolve on, on how the meaning or the purpose of education evolves. Today, education is for employment, and on one hand, we see employment itself is getting disruptive, which is getting us to really question what kind of an education is future ready. But if you're saying education is not just for self fulfillment, but it's also towards what we do towards others and, the country or society at large, then I think the possibilities of how edtech would come and play a role towards those will also significantly change. So yeah, I think so. That I think, along with listening and interacting with our learners, students, families, educators, just listening and empathizing, I think all of these are few recommendations.
No, I think these are some great insights and very profound thoughts. Ashwath, thanks for this. I think I'm sure our listeners would benefit out of this.
Yeah.
And absolutely, I think this is great. I absolutely enjoyed this conversation with you, Ashwath. I think it's been an exhilarating experience for me to kind of gain some of your thoughts and understand, because where you sit and how you serve the society is very different than what we do. So, absolutely great talking to you, Ashwath.
Yeah.
I
So
wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you, Ritesh. Thank you for this opportunity. I think these all your questions, it kind of got me to really pause and think, and so I'm really grateful for to you to give me this opportunity as well. I also equally learned, and hopefully we'll be able to have like a second part to this conversation where I'm also able to gather a lot of your perspective on these things, especially from the vantage point that you operate with. So thank you.
Thank you again, Ashwath, and hope to see you probably in the upcoming episodes with us. Thank you.